Lord Holmes of Richmond.
My Lords, it's with mixed feelings that I rise to open this debate this evening. It's an important debate, but it's a debate that we shouldn't need to have. Shared space is a problem completely artificially created, which should never have come across our urban landscape. It's a debate we shouldn't need to have because 5 years ago, the noble Lord Lowe, stood up in this chamber and warned local authorities as to the dangers of shared space. And yet 5 years on, if not quite an epidemic, shared space has swept the United Kingdom like a pernicious Class A drug. So what is shared space? Quite simply, it's this: taking away traffic signals, pedestrian crossings, road markings, pavements, and having everybody in that shared space. Toddlers and tankers, buses and blind people in the same shared space, with the belief that as a result of this, everybody will behave better and have a more inclusive shared experience. My Lords, as I hope this debate will clearly and emphatically point out, that is not the experience for millions of people up and down this nation. The proponents of shared space say, of course blind people are at a disadvantage. Of course they are. They're at a disadvantage in everything in life. Plus ça change. Quel dommage. Well, my Lords, we should mind, because that kind of logic in urban design is completely unacceptable. That was the reason I launched my report, Accidents by Design, which I published earlier this year in July. What I surveyed over 600 people, and the findings were stark. The report findings demonstrated that whether you were blind or fully sighted, disabled or non-disabled, a cyclist, a motorist, a parent with young children, your experience of shared space was unremittingly negative. Almost 2/3 of people saying they had a negative experience of shared space. Perhaps even more concerning, 35% of people said they actively avoided shared space. That's 35% of people, over a third of the population, effectively planned out of their local area. Those are the statistics, but I wanted the report to really speak with the voices of the respondents. I wanted their experiences to come through, to gain those narratives, that qualitative data to sit alongside the quantitative statistics. So let's hear some of those voices. A pedestrian described her local shared space scheme as lethally dangerous. A motorist said his local scheme was an absolute nightmare that he sought to avoid. Now that point is interesting, my Lords, because if proponents of shared space are actively using it, if their primary purpose is to create traffic-free areas, then they should be honest and open and have the debate on those grounds, rather than using unconsenting pedestrians as human shields for their plan. A cyclist, shared space is a promise that simply doesn't deliver. Many people talk about feelings of danger, of being intimidated, of feeling terrified. Is this what we want to create for our local communities, our townscapes in 21st century Britain? The report was widely received, and yet the proponents of shared space sought to push it to one side, suggesting again that it was only an issue for blind people. It's clear it's an issue for the entire population up and down the country, and yet hundreds of schemes are still in the planning process right across the country. The scheme, as a concept, came out of the Netherlands. Presumably, my lords, it's working incredibly well there. In fact, it's not. The scheme is fundamentally flawed and can't possibly deliver on the promise set out in the government guidance that this will lead to pedestrians being able to move with more comfort and ease and enable everybody to better share the space. Whichever design, whichever method, it simply fails if you believe that traffic signals, pedestrian crossings, curbs can be removed and everybody can share one open space. My lords, what happens when the problems of these schemes are discovered? U-turn after U-turn up and down the country. The reinstatement of pedestrian crossings, the reinstatement of traffic lights in Hackbridge, in Warwick, in tens of other schemes up and down the country. Even better, where schemes are abandoned before they get off the ground, once the consultation gives that clear steer from the local community, these schemes don't work, as was the case most recently in the proposed scheme for the Isle of Man. Schemes still remain, as I've said, my lords, on plan up and down the country. If this debate can do anything, I want it to raise awareness across the population. Do you want your taxes to be spent on schemes that exclude, on schemes that are dangerous, on schemes that terrify? I would ask my noble friend, the Minister, these questions. I urge the government to strongly consider an immediate moratorium on all future shared space until there can be a thorough analysis done of the impact on the local community. Similarly, I urge the government to classify so-called courtesy crossings. These are non-crossings where pedestrians have to take their life in their hands to try and get across the road, where nobody has right-of-way. I urge the government, these crossings need to be classified so accident data can be reported and centrally recorded, so we can know the truth about shared space, where at the moment so much smoke and mirrors exist. The reality is, as my report evidenced, a massive underreporting of accidents, serious incidents, and sadly sometimes fatalities in these shared spaces. I asked the Minister to review the Department for Transport guidance to enable it to better support local authorities who are being hoodwinked into the bogus benefits of these schemes. I asked the Minister, does the government believe these schemes prove value for money when all too often they have to be refitted, retrofitted, lights, signals, curbs reinstated? Is this value for money at a time of incredible pressure on local authority finance? And finally, I asked the Minister this: does the government believe that in any sense so-called shared space delivers in terms of equality, the Act and the public sector equality duty? To local authorities, I say this: tread carefully if you're thinking of walking down the road to shared space. It will exclude, it will intimidate. You will be sacrificing safety on the altar of architectural conceit, planning folly, and a scheme which is all about form over function. I say to local authorities, this will cost, and the cost is measured in so many ways. The financial cost of reinstallation, the legal cost potentially, as we currently have 3 local authorities on the end of legal action by residents who believe that they have been discriminated against under the Equality Act. The councils have instructed Top London QC. To the residents again, is this what you believe your tax should be spent on? Rather than having planning which includes everyone from the outset? That's just the financial cost. What of the human cost? As already mentioned, 35% of people actively avoiding shared space, a third of people excluded from their local communities. Accidents, incidents, in Coventry, in Leek, and tragically in other destinations, people killed in shared space. And my thoughts go out to their families. In conclusion, I hope all local authorities take note of this debate, read it, and think very, very seriously before embarking on any shared space scheme. It will cost, it will exclude, they will not be safe. You may well find yourself in court as a result.
My Lords, first can I congratulate Lord Holmes for obtaining this debate and for the work that he's done in the whole disability area on shared space. Lord Lowe has been extremely active in this area as well, and the national charities, the RNIB Guide Dogs and the National Federation of the Blind. And today, an issue of great significance, I think, is being brought before this House. Now, I am not a particular fan of shared space, but I would say perhaps the Armageddon picture that's just been painted may not fully reflect the experience up and down the country. There are definitely supporters of shared space, and there are many that look at particular schemes and explain that they work reasonably for all members of a particular community. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of significant issues, and I actually very much support the recommendations that Lord Holmes came forward with. Those very specific recommendations seem to me to make a great deal of sense. My Lords, when I was in the department for 18 months, disability was within my portfolio. We made some significant progress in that area. It's a very important issue. To my mind, it is absolutely crucial that people who have a disability are accepted as a normal part of our society, needing all the opportunities and access that any normal person in our society requires. And in those areas where the department had complete control, I think we made some very significant progress, for example, on accessible stations. And the industry began to change, the transport industry, that is culturally beginning to shift in its understanding that as it plans and moves forward, it must see disabled people as a normal part of its user group, not as an afterthought, an added extra, that's an amendment to a plan. And that's a really significant change. But, my Lord, when we tried to make progress on quite a number of issues, we were thwarted on 2 grounds, and I'm concerned that those 2 do remain in play. The first was the group that I would call the anti-red tape Red Guards. They did exist in the government when I was there, ministers for whom every regulation was by definition bad and had to be halted. And frankly, no matter what the benefits, and frankly, in order to provide opportunity and access for disabled people, frequently there is a role for sensible, smart, appropriate regulation, and it's often very difficult to tackle a problem, and shared space is a good example when that is ruled off the table. I don't know if that has changed. I hope it has. But it was a definite and complete obstacle. And the number of times we got overturned, that still makes me frustrated to this day. The other area where we had great challenges was whenever we tried to work into an area which also was fell into the purview of DCLG. Of all the departments in government that I've dealt with, DCLG was the least sympathetic to disability of any of them. And one of the reasons why we didn't go ahead and attempt to revise the guidance is we were very concerned it could end up worse at the end of a process because of the view that DCLG took on that. Now, I hope many of the people have changed. That we have a different Secretary of State. I hope that might be a different environment, and that at this point in time, that review of guidance could go ahead. What we did is provide to all relevant parties the charter, the advice on shared space from the National Federation for the Blind, which had developed that charter in cooperation with all of the other disability groups. And I have to say, local authorities who were sensitive to these issues immediately understood why they were being provided with that, and we created a link through to it from the department's webpage. To understand they need to broaden their views and understand the implications if they looked at shared space opportunities. That, of course, doesn't deal with those local authorities who are simply insensitive to these issues. And frankly, probably insensitive to guidance on any front. So I hope there is a real opportunity now to relook at that guidance. I also, though, want to say, every time this issue was raised, it would be pointed out to me by those who didn't want to see change, and proponents of shared space, that one disability group is in conflict with another disability group. They would look at people in wheelchairs and with mobility issues for whom curbs are an endless problem and say, look, that is a group that benefits from accessibility when we have shared space, and you have to keep those issues in consideration as well. And I'm so delighted that Lady Thomas is here today, because I believe that all disability groups understand each other's problems, understand the constraints that they have to live with, and I do want to see the whole disability community, whether it's around mobility or vision or hearing, come together and develop a common platform around this issue, because that is the way to get past that constant obstacle that is put forward to re-looking at, re-examining and finding better ways to tackle this problem. And it is important to bring in the motoring community, which has been quite a strong proponent of shared space, but may I also say the cycling community. And again, I think that is a potentially sympathetic community. But so often when meeting with cycling groups, they have not understood the concern, what it's like to be someone who depends on other people avoiding you as you're trying to cross a street, to have to become disoriented because there's an absence of appropriate markers, to have to turn to other people and become dependent in order to move around. And I do think engaging with the cycling community is absolutely key around this issue, and it hasn't happened anything like enough. Before I left office, so Lord Lowe was in my office, I believe Lord Holmes was there as well, and we agreed that the time had come to have something, I'd call it a summit, but essentially a gathering together of all the relevant parties from the local authorities, the various voices from the disability community, and the engineering and design and planning community, to start to really discuss these issues in great detail and come to a common platform and consensus. And it seems to me something like that becomes the basis for guidance in the future, driven not by just a consultation done by the DFT and then rewritten by DCLG, offers a path forward around not only this issue, but hopefully creates that ongoing dialogue, because all of the groups that we're talking about meet and cross each other in so many different environments, that if we can get that common understanding, that communication and that exchange of ideas, then I think we can craft a way forward, and I hope very much that the Minister is able to achieve it.
My Lords, I too should like to congratulate the noble Lord Holmes on securing this debate and bringing this matter again to your Lordship's attention. I say again because, as he observed, I introduced a QSD in remarkably similar terms about 5.5 years ago, but to very little effect. The Minister, whom I knew to be a very sensible man, asked me in advance what I hoped to get out of the debate, but then went on to comprehensively shaft me in his wind-up speech. Sensible or not, he'd simply swallowed his departmental brief whole. Afterwards, the noble Lord Jenkin, who is also a very sensible man, said to me that he had learned 2 things in life. One was to keep pegging away, and the other was that it always pays to make a fuss. Well, I intend to make a fuss. Lord Holmes has done us all a signal service by putting his effort where his mouth is and carrying out some actual research on the matter, which he has written up in a report with the singularly apposite title, Accidents by Design. This has been hailed by a member of the National Federation of the Blind in the following terms. This damning blitz, he said, this damning blitz on a pet concept of professional streetscapers to impose on the public realm has been shown up as unpopular with people, impractical for our high streets, and even misreported by the media. The eloquence and focus of the Holmes report must read like a breath of fresh air, not only to blind and partially sighted people, but indeed to a third of the public, whom the report found actively avoid shared space. My Lords, as we've heard, the idea behind shared space schemes is that if you remove the traditional demarcators of separate space for pedestrians and motorists, things like curbs, railings, and controlled crossings, and as Ben Hamilton Bailey, the arch-evangelist for shared space, has put it, fully integrate traffic into urban design so that pedestrians are expected to mingle interchangeably with cyclists, cars, buses, and 10-ton lorries, a more ambiguous environment will be created, you can say that again, which, being more difficult to interpret, and with the risk that pedestrians may be sharing the same space, encourages motorists to drive more cautiously and courteously. My Lords, that's not how it appeared to me when I went to see it in action outside Sloane Square Tube Station with the then chair of the APPG on eye health and visual impairment. All went well for a while, but sadly, just after she'd left, a car came charging through the shared space area, obviously quite oblivious of the fact that it was a shared space, and went slap into another car with a great deal of effing and blinding in consequence. Mr. Hamilton Bailey tells us that shared space has now become an accepted approach to street design in many countries, and that the UK, having started very late, was now beginning to take the lead. As we've heard, it's expected that priority in the shared space area is negotiated primarily through eye contact. This obviously puts blind people at a severe disadvantage, but the lack of delineation can make the street more difficult to understand for people with learning difficulties, and the disabled are not the only people affected. The shared surface environment is likely to be much more frightening for elderly people. Small children are told to stop at the curb's edge, look and listen before crossing the road. How can they do that if there isn't a curb? My Lords, this whole idea is self-evidently balmy. We're indebted to the noble Lord for documenting this in detail. People's experiences of shared space schemes are overwhelmingly negative. 63% of those who have used shared surface schemes rated their experience as poor. Over a third, as Lord Holmes has told us, over a third of people actively avoid them altogether. This pattern or response was reflected across most choices of travel, with 66% of drivers and 64% of pedestrians rating their experience as poor, with nearly a half of cyclists, 48%, reporting their experience as poor. Yet overzealous councils continue risking public safety with fashionable simplified street design. In January 2013, a partially sighted pensioner was killed in Coventry after being hit by a bus on a shared space scheme in an area that previously had a pedestrian-controlled crossing. The court ruled that the bus driver wasn't responsible for the death after hearing a statement that the shared surface was so confusing as to make an accident inevitable. Yet, the Noble Lord's report tells us that there is significant underreporting of accidents in shared space areas. People constantly referred to finding schemes frightening, intimidating, dangerous, and never feeling safe. People commented on poor visibility when trying to cross roads, often due to parked cars and vehicles not stopping to allow them to cross. One respondent summed up the shared space they used as lethally dangerous. In poor light or glare or shadow, drivers can't see pedestrians. Disabled people and those with poor sight or mobility cannot protect themselves. The idea behind such spaces depends on every user being 100% able and 100% alert at all times, which just doesn't happen in real life. He continued, I consider this whole idea to be completely and criminally insane. One blind user, unable to access a local shared space independently, said, "For people with no sight like myself, they're a death trap. I can't express how terrible they are and how they make me feel so angry. To think all the people responsible for them expect us to use it when we can't see. I use the one in Leek with my husband, but never on my own." Local authorities aren't in promoting these schemes aren't meeting the public sector equality duty. Under the public sector equality duty, public bodies must have due regard to advancing equality through removing or minimising disadvantages suffered by people due to their protected characteristics, taking steps to meet the needs of people from protected groups where these are different from the needs of other people, and thirdly, encouraging people from protected groups to participate in public life or in other activities where their participation is disproportionately low. By authorising shared space schemes, local authorities are not removing or minimising disadvantages suffered by disabled people, but are, in fact, doing the exact opposite. By failing to install curbs or adequate alternative tactile delineation and controlled crossings, they're not taking steps to meet the needs of people with sight loss, which are different to the needs of other people. My Lords, the Noble Lord Holmes calls for a moratorium until proper impact assessments have been carried out. And Guide Dogs also calls for a moratorium pending the production of proper statutory guidance. My Lords, I see the noble Baroness Lady Kramer as a friend and would want to commend her on the work she did while at the department, but I fear I remain a subscriber to her Armageddon scenario. I think we know enough about shared space schemes to know about the harm they cause and the lack of evidence that they do any good. I spoke to someone the other day who told me that he'd been talking to a planner who told him that the main value of shared space schemes was aesthetic. My Lords, I think we don't need a moratorium. I think they should be banned.
My Lords, at the outset I must confess that I have not myself had a great deal of experience of shared spaces, but when I have encountered one on foot, I like the general ambience, the absence of curbs and the lack of nose-to-tail traffic. However, I can see that there is nothing to commend them, the blind and vision impaired people, and many severely mobility impaired people, unless there is no traffic at all. And the Noble Lord Holmes of Richmond has quite rightly highlighted this problem as one that must be addressed urgently, and I congratulate him for securing this debate. First, we must make sure we're all talking about the same thing, and I'm grateful for Living Streets for providing a glossary of terms in their brief. That shared space, shared surface and shared use are all a bit different. The Noble Lord's question is about shared spaces. In other words, and I quote, a street or public space where vehicle movement and other activities are combined through informal social protocols, negotiation and design solutions rather than through formal regulations and controls. Now, I have read the guidance, which I think is in Local Transport Note 1/11, and was concerned to read the rather complacent sentence under visual impairment. It said, if the context and objectives of a shared space scheme proposal indicate that a curb-free design is desirable, mitigating measures may be required. Is that really good enough? The conventional view, of course, is that a shared space is a welcoming and friendly environment which enhances everyone's experience of using it, whether for shopping, meeting people, sightseeing, etc., where pedestrians, cyclists and drivers all have to watch out for each other, as no one group has priority over using the space. However, if just one important group of people, namely blind or vision impaired people, have an overwhelmingly negative experience, then the shared space is not working and should be altered, not least because the local authority is failing in its public sector equality duty under the Equality Act 2010, which Noble Lord Lowe has just mentioned. It's very important to mention this duty because it is becoming used less and less now as we move away from the 2010 Equality Act. So it's a very good thing, I think, to mention it at this point. All shared spaces are different, and it is the responsibility of the local authority to make it possible for society as a whole to use a shared space. One study done in Hereford, to which I will refer later, said that participants liked the principle of shared spaces more than the practice. As I said at the outset, as somebody with mobility problems, I like the absence of curbs because steep curbs are impossible for me to navigate, and there are many, many roads where you have to go for a long distance to find a dropped curb. They are not as prevalent as they should be in this country. But for somebody with a visual impairment, the lack of curbs makes it equally impossible for them to get their bearings. And some of the reasoning by planners, such as the eye contact rule, again Lord Lowe highlighted this, shows this up. When I asked Keith Hatter, the chair of Winchester Area Access for All, for his views as somebody with a visual impairment, he said, the idea that eye contact should be a means of interaction between motorists and pedestrians is an irresponsible one, not only for visually impaired people, but also for those, such as wheelchair users, whose eye level may be different from that of most pedestrians. Mr. Hatter is forthright about priorities, stating that he believes the ethos of a shared space must be that pedestrians have priority, and that it is motorists who should give way. And he is surely right to say that there should be a clearly marked route without traffic around the perimeter of any shared space so that vulnerable pedestrians and wheelchair users know they will be safe there. For this to be a reliable space, it must be kept free from restaurant tables and chairs, A-boards, etc. To some people, this might seem to negate the whole idea of a shared space, but this is the minimum requirement, it seems to me, of a reasonable adjustment which society must make to stop anyone feeling excluded because of a disability. The question of curbs is a difficult one. Mr. Hatter makes the point that the use of little curbs is problematic because they are a real trip hazard. He advocates the installation of curbs of at least 18 millimetres in depth with strategically placed drop curbs, because he says that a guided dog would then recognise it as a point at which to stop to await further instructions. There was an interesting study done in Hereford a few years ago, which I mentioned earlier, about a shared space in Widemarsh Street, which is only open to traffic at certain times of day. There was a Brown College in Hereford which had insisted, I believe, on the installation of little curbs, but they caused a lot of people to trip, and those who did the study concluded that a tactile edge was a much better compromise than a curb. This brings me back to my main point, which is that for shared spaces to work successfully, they have to be thought through very carefully, with full consultation with as many users as possible, particularly with vulnerable users. Contrastingly coloured paving must surely be used as well as tactile marking. Personally, I think that bus routes should not be considered for proper shared spaces. In my limited experience, bus drivers will always think they take priority, whatever the original concept of all users being equal might be. Going back to the guidance, I was alarmed to read on page 46 the following sentence. There is anecdotal evidence of buses and taxis sometimes travelling at inappropriate speed on certain shared space streets. It might therefore be worthwhile contacting bus operators and local taxi companies to ensure their drivers are aware of what is required of them when passing through these areas. Again, my lords, I ask whether that vague suggestion is anywhere near good enough. The Hammond and Musselwhite Hereford study ended thus. It can be concluded that context is crucially important, and different areas require different urban form or infrastructure changes. Shared space isn't a single concept, but a term that encapsulates many different designs bespoke for the relevant context. End of quote. My lords, I agree with this conclusion that each shared space plan must be bespoke, with everybody's needs rigorously taken into account. And most importantly, there must be post-scheme monitoring. And I would like to add my voice to those others who have asked the Minister what action the Government will now take.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Baroness Thomas, who has provided a lot of very practical ideas in this debate. But I too am very grateful to the Noble Lord Holmes for initiating this debate, which is of interest to thousands and thousands of people, but especially blind and vision impaired citizens up and down the country. And it is indeed a great way to raise awareness. I pay tribute to the work that he's done on shared spaces and to his excellent report, but I also pay tribute to the work of the Noble Lord Lowe. My own interest in this issue comes from my association with an excellent small charity in the Forest of Dean, Forest Sensory Services, of which I'm patron, and which provides invaluable support to people with audio or visual impairment who are too often isolated and sometimes in despair when first diagnosed. One of our great supporters and users is called Bill Waddle, and he spoke to me of his concerns about shared spaces many months ago and introduced me to the brilliant campaigner Sarah Gayton, who has done so much to raise awareness about the problems. Lord Holmes, my lords, has provided a real public service by taking the time to write an honest, tough report, which was eye-opening in so many ways, speaking, as he said, with the voice of those most affected. And I wholeheartedly endorse the 3 recommendations about which he has questioned the noble Lord the Minister this afternoon. My lords, when so much concern has been expressed by such a wide range of our population, from blind people and cyclists to the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Highways Engineers and the House of Commons Transport Committee, and when there are frequent, often serious accidents, I simply do not understand why the Government has not introduced a moratorium on shared space schemes while impact assessments are conducted, let alone updated its guidance so that local authorities better understand their responsibilities under the Equalities Act. Although the view of the noble Baroness Kramer on the reason for the delay of updating the guidance is indeed illuminating, and I look forward to hearing the views of the noble Lord the Minister on that. According to guide dogs, whom I must thank for a very useful briefing, current estimates suggest that there are 2 million people with sight loss in the UK, of which around 360,000 are registered blind or partially sighted. As noble lords have said, it is essential that local authorities meet their obligations to them under the public sector equality duty. But by authorising shared space surface schemes, local authorities are doing the opposite and turning city centres into no-go areas. The noble Baroness Kramer, when Minister of Transport, wrote to all local authorities to remind them of the current guidance and duties under the Equalities Act, and said that the Government expects highway authorities to work towards high-quality, attractive and inclusive streets that work for people of all abilities. Sadly, this has had absolutely no effect, so action is now needed. In my own city of Gloucester, we had a shared space at Kimbrow's Triangle. As with every other shared space, this is a nightmare for visually impaired people, and I can say from experience it was not comfortable for drivers and sighted pedestrians, let alone mums and dads with small children or the elderly or people with other disabilities. Bill Waddle and others made representations to the councils and said that the shared space should be replaced by a puffin crossing, which I understand is best for blind people. But in their wisdom, the authorities continue with a courtesy crossing, which is not only inappropriate and dangerous for visually impaired people and a headache for cyclists, it has led to a congestion problem about which drivers, including taxi drivers, are understandably concerned. I realise that this is a parochial concern, and I would not expect the noble Lord the Minister to comment on the specifics, but it is an example of local authorities' unwillingness to listen, and I would add to take seriously their responsibilities under the Equalities Act, an act that I am particularly attached to as I took it through this House. There is evidence throughout the country that shared spaces are not working, quite the contrary. They are dangerous, and some have even called their proliferation, and I quote, the largest systematic institutionalised discrimination against blind people that the UK has ever seen. End of quote. I therefore ask the Minister if he would agree that there's an urgent need to assess the reality of what is happening in respect of these schemes, so that there's a real evidence base. I noted in the report of the noble Lord that a DFT spokesperson said, and I quote, "It is for local authorities to assess the suitability of introducing a shared space scheme on their roads." And I fear that the Government may therefore refuse to take any action at national level. But as with so many issues, this devolution of responsibility simply isn't good enough. This is a question of safety, and central government should make a national assessment. The problem is not limited to the UK. There are schemes being developed in many European countries. As the noble Lord himself said, it was introduced in the Netherlands, but also now in Austria, Germany and other countries, which are having a terrible impact on the lives and mobility of blind people, as well as causing accidents. So I wonder if this is something that we should be looking at from a European perspective. Whatever one thinks about the principle of freedom of movement, and I strongly support it, the truth is that because of the growth of shared spaces, the freedom of blind people to move independently in this country and in other parts of the European Union is being impaired. On the issue of Europe, I wonder if the noble Lord the Minister could confirm that European funds are being used to build shared spaces in Coventry, Stoke, Blackpool and Wakefield. If this is the case, I have to say that I'm not sure that proper account is being taken in relation to the European regulations, which state that accessibility for persons with disabilities must be taken into consideration when programmes are prepared and implemented. I also take this opportunity to highlight an issue which I'm sure leads to some headaches in the Department of Transport. That is the potential conflict between the pursuit of green transport policies and the needs of blind people. For example, the removal of traffic lights to ease congestion makes it difficult, at times impossible, for blind people to cross the road. And if you put together the removal of standard crossings with the welcome growth of electric and hybrid cars, which are often very quiet, you create an immense problem for people who are visually impaired. One solution would be to ensure that all new cars are required to make a noise, and I wonder if that is now mandatory. My Lords, thanks to the Noble Lord Holmes, this has been an excellent debate, and I trust that the Noble Lord the Minister will now ensure that words are turned into action. This is important for all citizens, but especially for blind people. I would remind him that the 3rd of December is the UN International Day for Persons with Disabilities. The theme for 2015 is access and empowerment for people of all abilities, and one of the sub-themes is making cities inclusive and accessible for all. The Minister now has 7 weeks to act so that blind and vision impaired people can have a real celebration on that day.
My Lords, I too will join with all others in congratulating Lord Holmes in securing this debate, and I particularly want to pay tribute to him for his persistence in raising this issue and highlighting this issue, and indeed that of the Noble Lord, Lord Lowe in previous years. I don't actually believe, speaking as a former councillor for 40 years, that most local authorities deliberately set out to make life difficult for people. It may often feel like that, but I don't think that is actually the reality, my Lords. I think what the Noble Lord Holmes has done and the service he has given to us is to highlight issues and important issues that local authorities simply have not thought about as much as they should. And in this particularly, I think, the attention that should be given to the public sector equality duty when considering traffic schemes. We do so in so many other ways, but so often, in my experience anyway, looking at a traffic scheme, that is not properly considered, or if it is only to the extent of those with mobility difficulties, as distinct from sensory ones. My Lords, I wanted to contribute today with some local experience, and the Noble Lord Holmes, in introducing the debate, made a passing reference to Hackbridge. My Lords, Hackbridge is in the London Borough of Sutton, where I was a councillor for 40 years until last year. It's next door to the London Borough, in fact very close to the London Borough of Merton, where the Minister was a councillor for a rather lesser period, but it may well be that he knows personally the area to which I am going to refer. My intention to this debate was first drawn to me by my former colleagues in Sutton, and they had been informed about it at a very early stage by Sutton Vision, and in particular by its Vice-Chair Michael Parsons and by Tracy Collins, who also lives in Hackbridge, from whom my colleagues had received huge help in the area of Hackbridge. My Lords, the ambition is to make Hackbridge a sustainable suburb, probably the first in the UK, by the year 2020, and much work is being done with the local community towards this aim. As part of this, last year a scheme was completed, investing £1.4 million in the area to make it more accessible and more attractive. This scheme included a new road layout and the provision of a number of what are called informal crossings, particularly around a busy road junction and by a local primary school. A subsequent independent user survey did find, in fact, that 83% of those surveyed believed the scheme had improved their perception of the area, 80% said it had made the area more attractive and appealing, and 68% said it enhanced their satisfaction with the local shopping area. Indeed, my Lords, even the local shopkeepers were happy. So, my Lords, there is no doubt that the area now is more visually attractive. But, my Lords, and it's a very important but, that is of no benefit at all to those who cannot see it. The provision of so many informal crossings and no controlled crossings on busy roads means that the visually impaired no longer feel safe crossing those roads. Michael Parsons, to whom I referred earlier, who lives in the area and who uses a guide dog, no longer feels able to use his local shopping centre, which he has used for many years, because he cannot cross the busy road. He and others like him cannot know if all the vehicles coming from either direction have actually seen him and have stopped. He does not know for sure where the pavement ends and the highway begins, because there is no curb. My lords, we have produced a very visually attractive scheme which has had the effect of excluding a minority, but a significant minority of the local community. My lords, I think this sums up the issues that we are debating today. Needless to say, important lessons have been learned from this, and next month Sutton Council is to begin a wide public consultation on 4 options for tackling these issues. All those options have been passed by an independent safety audit, and all of them include a zebra crossing, a controlled crossing in other words, to replace the current informal crossing nearest the school, and to provide other controlled crossings. The debate primarily, my lords, is about where to locate such crossings. Hopefully, when this is all done and the work is carried out, Michael Parsons and others in his position will again feel safe crossing the road to use their local shopping centre. My lords, I hadn't intended my contribution today to be a debate about Hackbridge. I'm very grateful to the noble Lord Holmes even for mentioning it. But I do see it as a very real example of the issues we are debating today. Hackbridge had a scheme designed by experienced traffic engineers from the Greater London Authority and from Sutton Council, with a huge amount of local community involvement, all with the best of intentions, and it produced a high level of local satisfaction. But, my lords, within a year it has had to be redesigned simply because it did not pay enough attention to the needs of the visually impaired. I've asked my Sutton colleagues what I should be asking for in this debate. All of them, my lords, councillors and officers alike, have said that the present guidance is woefully inadequate and sometimes contradictory, particularly in respect of the needs of visually impaired people. All of them have said that there is an urgent need for the guidance to be reviewed and for new guidance to be produced. As is often the case, views differ on whether such guidance should be statutory or not. I'll be interested in the Minister's view on that. But I would simply say, in support of the need for it to be statutory, a comment has been made to me that, like economists, no 2 traffic engineers ever agree with each other. I could add to that, my lords, that in my view there's an added problem in that, unlike economists, every one of us, and certainly every driver, believes that they are an expert traffic engineer. My lords, I learned from the excellent briefing from Guide Dogs that the last government committed to review and update its guidance by the end of 2012. That has still not happened. So will the Minister tell us if the present government is still committed to this review, and if so, by when will it be committed? Or, my lords, perhaps I could ask a little cheekily, was it a commitment forced by the Liberal Democrat part of the coalition government, which has now been dropped by the new Conservative government? And I hope, my lords, that that alone might prompt an answer from the Minister. My lords, the enthusiasm for shared space originates, as has been said, from the Netherlands, where it is quite widespread. I'm not competent to talk about the success or otherwise in the Netherlands, but I do again have some, by association, some personal experience. My son lived and worked in Amsterdam for 7 years, where, like so many others, a bicycle was his main mode of local transport. I have to say, unlike the many years he spent living in the London Borough of Sutton. When he came back to the UK, he moved to Oxford, where he still lives. Oxford must be one of the British cities most used to cyclists, my lords. Yet my son was astonished by the contrast between the attitude of road users in Amsterdam and those in Oxford. This is not a debate, my lords, about cycling, but this contrast, I think, does illustrate why shared space may well work well in the Netherlands, if it does, but not in the UK. It's not just about good design, my lords. It is just as much about road user culture and attitude. In the Netherlands, there is a much greater tolerance between different types of road user and a much better understanding and acceptance of their different needs and difficulties. Perhaps the Minister can say something about what the government is doing to change attitudes and increase tolerance and understanding amongst British road users with regard to shared space. But, my lords, until that is achieved, shared space will not work naturally, however attractive it may look to those who can see it. My lords, regulation and good design drawn from practical experience will still be required, and I very much endorse the comments made, or the call made by my noble friend Baroness Kramer for a proper summit involving all interested parties before a consultation and before the revised guidance is produced. Comments or reference has also been made to the problem of silent vehicles, my lords, and I think all of us will have experienced the problem of silent cyclists who regard the pavement or footpath as a shared space, often because they don't feel safe on the highway. My lords, that problem is now growing with the increase in the number of electric and hybrid vehicles that move silently up behind us all. So, my lords, I hope the Minister can also say if the government accept that as an issue that must be addressed, whether in respect of shared space or more widely. Finally, my lords, may I end by thanking the noble Lord Holmes for giving us this most interesting and important debate. We look forward to the Minister's reply, and I am quite sure that the noble Lord Holmes will continue to persist as vigorously as he has done up till now.
As have other noble lords, I'd like to thank the noble Lord Holmes of Richmond for securing this debate and for his report on this issue, which, as he says, was published 3 months ago, shortly before the recess. The noble lord's report is a much-needed reminder that what may seem an exciting and interesting development must be implemented with care and with the needs and requirements of all members of the community in mind. Reference has already been made to the survey the noble Lord Holmes launched and its findings, with nearly 2/3 of the sample rating their experience of a shared space as poor, just under 20% as fair, and 18% as good. And on those rating their experience as poor, this was in no way confined to those reporting a long-standing condition or disability, for whom the figure was 70%, since for those reporting no disability, the figure was still 57%. On the basis of what is very limited personal experience I have of shared spaces, I prefer using them as a pedestrian than I do as a motorist, but then I do not have a disability. And when using a shared space as a motorist, though, my concern is certainly not that I need to drive slowly, but that I may still be involved in a collision with a pedestrian due to factors referred to by the noble Lord Holmes of Richmond in his report, and indeed by other noble lords in this debate. The Department for Transport 2011 Local Transport Note, entitled Shared Space, refers to the fact that the 2010 Equality Act introduced an equality duty which requires public bodies to play their part in making society fairer by tackling discrimination and providing equality of opportunity for all. And it goes on to say that authorities will have to consider how different people are likely to be affected by new shared space scheme proposals, and will have to give due regard to the effect such schemes might have on those protected by the equality duty. So what we are talking about is not a due regard that ought to be taken into account, but is a due regard that is required to be taken into account. And a clear failure to do so must ultimately leave any public sector bodies or authorities responsible potentially open to the prospect of some form of legal proceedings under the 2010 Equality Act. And it would be helpful if the Noble Lord the Minister could say whether the government consider that that is a correct interpretation of the position, and if it is, have there been any successful legal proceedings taken on this point under the 2010 Equality Act in relation to shared space schemes? The Department for Transport document to which I have referred states that shared space is a design approach that seeks to change the way streets operate by reducing the dominance of motor vehicles, primarily through lower speeds, and encouraging drivers to behave more accommodatingly towards pedestrians. What happens if there is a deficiency in that more accommodating behaviour is not an issue that is then addressed. The document goes on to say that improving pedestrian movement and comfort, as well as creating vibrant spaces, are likely to be primary objectives, and that a high level of sharing should only be considered an objective in its own right if it contributes to these higher order ones. The document also stresses the importance of post-scheme monitoring to record user behaviour and to assess whether a scheme is operating as planned. Now, the extent to which post-scheme monitoring is actually taking place is not clear, and perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister could tell us when he responds if the government have any information on this point. Because in the light of what we've heard in this debate, and indeed in Lord Holmes' report, then surely post-scheme monitoring, if it has been taking place objectively with all appropriate parties, must surely have thrown up some of the serious issues being discussed today. Now, the very helpful briefing pack for this debate, prepared by the House of Lords Library, includes a document from the National Federation of the Blind of the UK, dated January last year, which states that despite a DFT document stating that since shared surfaces can cause problems for some disabled people, and that it was important that shared surface schemes include an alternative means for visually impaired people to navigate by, no DFT guidance is given on this matter, with the result that in many shared spaces this instruction has not been implemented, resulting in people with little or no sight being frightened to use these areas, a finding of the Noble Lord Holmes' report as well. The document from the National Federation of the Blind sets out the general abilities and limitations of blind people and of trained guide dogs in order to provide assistance to planners and designers who are responsible for ensuring that streetscape layouts are fully inclusive and meet the requirements of the public sector equality duty. Could the Noble Lord the Minister confirm what the status is of this document from the National Federation of the Blind in the eyes of the DFT, since it indicates it should be read in conjunction with DFT guidance documents? The briefing we've had from the Guide Dogs for the Blind Association calls for the government to issue clear, current statutory guidance for local authorities to use when developing streetscapes to ensure they are safe for people who are blind or partially sighted, and calls for a moratorium on local authorities commissioning shared surface schemes until up-to-date statutory guidance has been issued. Now, I've no doubt that when he responds, the Noble Lord the Minister will say something about the government's response to the key recommendations in the report from Lord Holmes of Richmond. But could he also respond to the call from the Guide Dogs for the Blind Association for statutory guidance and for a moratorium until such up-to-date statutory guidance has been issued? The report from the Noble Lord Holmes of Richmond also addressed the issue of accidents in shared spaces and the nature of some of those accidents and the very low reporting of incidents to the police. Is the Noble Lord the Minister able to provide us with any figures on the number of accidents in shared space schemes and the nature of those accidents, and whether the incidence is higher or lower or much the same as in conventional streets? Likewise, could the Noble Lord the Minister comment on the statement in Lord Holmes' report about non-reporting of accidents or incidents in shared spaces, and whether the low level of reporting referred to in the Noble Lord's report differs from the level of reporting of accidents or incidents in conventional streets? The report from Lord Holmes of Richmond raises some very serious issues about the design of at least some existing shared space schemes, and not just in respect of their impact on and consequences for blind and vision impaired people, but for people generally. Like other noble lords, I await with interest the response from the noble lord the Minister, and in particular whether the government agree with the basic findings of the report from Lord Holmes of Richmond, and indeed with the concerns on shared space schemes expressed by many noble lords in this debate. And if they do, and it's difficult to believe that either Lord Holmes's report or the concerns expressed today can be that wide of the mark, what actions the government are either considering or intend to take in respect of shared space schemes to address the issues highlighted in this debate, and particularly for blind and vision impaired people. The DfT cannot issue guidance on shared spaces and then wash its hands of the matter when that guidance either results in some worrying consequences or is not being followed with appropriate rigour.
My Lords, may I firstly say how grateful I am to all noble lords who've spoken through this afternoon and indeed early evening, but in particular my noble friend Lord Holmes for tabling this particular debate, and of course I welcome the opportunity to discuss the issues in more detail. Before I address the issues which have been raised today, may I also acknowledge the efforts of the noble Lord Lowe, who has been an avid campaigner and a relentless campaigner on this important issue. And I would like to make it clear that the government is committed to helping local authorities create more inclusive door-to-door journeys with accessible street environments, stations and transport interchanges. But underlying the point made by several noble lords, this is not to be done to the detriment of safety. Indeed, perhaps I speak with some experience. I have experienced shared spaces, and it's an area I've looked at before as well. The noble Lord Tope talked of my time as a councillor. During that time, I was also cabinet member for transport management and traffic management, amongst other things. And one of the things I learned as a councillor in local government, it's not different in central government. The noble Lady Baroness Kramer talked of experiences as a minister. One of the underlying principles when it came to traffic management schemes was not just if it looked good or sounded good, was did it make sense, and was it appropriate to the use of the local area and local residents. The concept of shared spaces is also an interesting one. We've heard it being defined clearly during this debate, or others may define it as my 3-year-old and 1-year-old define shared space, which is their mother and father's bed at 2 a.m. in the morning. So there are various challenges we all face in different aspects of our life. But nevertheless, there are important points which have been raised, and I will seek to take forward many of the questions and answer them. If I am unable to answer, of course, I shall write to noble lords in this respect. The Department of Transport and the UK in general, I think we all would acknowledge, has had a good record of addressing the travel needs of disabled people when we consider this concept globally. It is standard in the UK to provide accessibility features such as tactile paving, drop curbs and audible and tactile indicators at traffic lights, more so than in many other countries. Shared space, may I emphasise, is just one option for local authorities to consider in designing streetscape and public realmscape schemes. It's a design approach that can help create attractive places, as we've heard, that people want to spend more time in without the dominance of motor traffic, a point made by the noble Lord Tope. This is achieved through a range of measures, the aim of which is to encourage all types of road users to share the full width of that particular street. Shared space design is a spectrum incorporating many design features. Courtesy crossings and level surfaces may feature, but are not a requirement, and I emphasise and fully accept are not suitable everywhere. Our position, from the government's perspective, is set out in the guidance, the Local Transport Note 111, published in 2011, and the guidance is backed up by extensive research undertaken to inform its development. The Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, Guide Dogs and the RNIB were all represented on the sounding board and the project board throughout the research. The DFT has also circulated more recent guidance produced by the NFB UK called Access for Blind People in Towns, and in December 2013 this was sent to over 3,000 designers and practitioners in local authorities and consultants. It is also made available via the department's website. It's of course worth noting that shared space is not a new concept, but has been used in residential areas for many years, such as Exeter High Street, and was redesigned as a shared space around 30 years ago. Many rural settlements and historic streets around the UK have always had the concept of a shared surface. However, all of these need to be considered in light of safety of all users. Local authorities, as where we are currently, are of course responsible for the design of their streets and their care. It is also good practice to monitor a scheme post-implementation to ensure it is working as expected. We do expect local authorities to monitor shared space schemes as any other design project and to adjust the design if needed. Indeed, several noble lords talked about how schemes, as did the noble Lord Tote, about schemes being reviewed after they've been implemented. And this isn't just, I would emphasise, just on shared spaces. There are other traffic management measures which are sometimes put in, which are then deemed inappropriate or inadequate for the original intent. My noble friend Lord Holmes rightly also refers to accident data, and although the department does collect accident statistics from local authorities, these do not detail whether specific incidents occurred at a courtesy crossing or in a shared space environment, but I will return to that particular point in a moment or two. Just briefly, if I may, on courtesy crossings. It really does say it should do what it says on the tin. Courtesy crossings are supposed to be one where all people and all users extend courtesy, but it is unfortunate that, of course, it's reliant on 100% adherence, and I fully accept that's not the case. Crossings are an important part of the street scenes, and by means which people can easily move around. The noble Lady Baroness Thomas talked about her own experience in a wheelchair. I can assure you, coming back to my children's example as well, that having two pushchairs which you pull round over and above curbs is not always the easiest point. But at the same time, that cannot be sacrificed for the safety and security as you're crossing roads, and I fully hear the points which noble lords have made. Whilst accepting that courtesy crossings are an alternative to formal crossings such as zebras or puffing crossings, they do not, as several noble lords pointed out, confer priority. They are sometimes used within a shared space but are not a requirement of shared space schemes per se. Whilst this remains a matter for local authorities, the justification for courtesy crossings is lower traffic speeds, reduced dominance of motor traffic in shared spaces. But I do accept, point well made by the noble Lady Baroness Royal, we do need an important dose of common sense by all users when it comes to such crossings. And of course, I accept also that they do not work everywhere, and their use needs to be carefully monitored and thought through. Formal crossings can still be provided with shared space, as can of course curbs. I am also aware that in some places where crossings have been removed, the local authority is now looking to reinstate them in some form. For example, in Kimbro's Triangle in Gloucester, I understand the council has now decided to put a zebra crossing in to address the local concerns that have been raised. From a DFT perspective, we strongly recommend that all crossings, formal or courtesy, are provided, coming to a point that the noble Lady Baroness Thomas raised, with tactile paving to ensure those with visual impairments are helped to navigate them. Of course, we all need to feel safe, but not just feel safe, be safe. We understand how navigation can sometimes be a problem for visually impaired people in shared space streets. Whilst our guidance does talk to this and stresses the importance of engaging with groups representing disabled people during the development of the scheme, it also refers to the need for authorities to ensure their designs are inclusive and reminds them of their duties under the Equalities Act. This was a point raised by the noble Lady Baroness Thomas and the noble Lord Rosser in his contributions as well. And therefore I do acknowledge fully the work done in this respect of my predecessor as Minister for Transport, the noble Lady Baroness Kramer, who indeed wrote to all local authorities in March this year to remind them of these duties. I did send up a box note to ask what was the response, and I'm sure noble lords may not be surprised to learn there was a nil return. And I think that does actually then put down and throw down the gauntlet and the challenge we face. Now, the noble Lord Lowe and my noble friend Lord Holmes, indeed noble Lord Rosser, amongst others, asked about a moratorium. And if we, as a government, will ask local authorities to refrain from implementing shared surface schemes until there's more evidence on the impacts. Let me assure noble lords, we are not promoting or encouraging the use of shared space over any other design approach. Local authorities remain responsible for their roads and do not seek DFT approval for such schemes. It's also difficult to see how a ban on shared space could be achieved in practice, as there would be no single design element we could point to which would allow us to say, do not install this. I'm sure we also acknowledge, as the noble Lord Tote pointed out, that in many cases, many residents find such schemes more attractive, and the driver behind any such schemes should be improving the public realm environment. Somewhere with a greater sense of place is important to most people in communities. Indeed, the noble Lord Tote talked about the Hackbridge example, but equally illustrated the other element, that this must be balanced with safety of all concerned, including those who are visually impaired. And that is an important, essential feature of any traffic schemes. Turning to a few of the questions, if I may, very briefly, post-scheme monitoring, and I've already alluded to this, and I will come on to some of the steps we will be taking, which the noble Lord Rosser raised. The status of the NFB documents, as I've already alluded, these have been circulated to local authorities, are available on our website. The noble Lord Tope asked about the revising guidance inclusive mobility and whether the DFT was still committed to revising this. If I can take this back, I'm aware the work has been done, but on a specific date I will write to the noble Lord in this respect. The noble Lord Rosser also raised issues on whether there were any legal cases pending relating to the equality scheme and specific statistics. And again, that's not readily available, and I shall write to the noble Lord in that respect. But moving forward, I think it is important, and one of the things I have learned in my time as a minister is to take note, but note also means to see how we can take and move things forward. And the noble lords may now, or may well be aware, that the government is currently working alongside the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation to produce guidance on shared streets to build upon the department's guidance in the local transport note. This guidance aims to use practical experience gained from recent schemes to build on the existing advice which is in the guidance. It will also identify good and bad practice and try to move away from the idea that shared space is somehow synonymous with a lack of definition between road and footway. Now, my understanding is that their scheme, and I asked for a specific date in preparation for this, that they seek to, the CIHT, aim to complete their work by the summer of 2016. My own department is fully engaged in this work and is a key member of the project steering group. In addition, the National Federation for the Blind UK have also been involved and attending a meeting on the 30th of September. I also understand my noble friend Lord Holmes has been in contact with CIHT and is due to meet with them to discuss their work. I also extend invitation to all noble lords concerned on this matter that I will be happy to facilitate a meeting with them to ensure that their actual report is both well informed and any other considerations that we need to take into account are also fully considered. I will also give the assurance that the conclusions of for my noble friend's report, the Holmes report, I shall refer to it now, will also be factored in fully into the work currently being undertaken by the CIHT. My lords, let me assure you that the government fully understands visually impaired people find challenges from shared space schemes, especially those with shared surfaces, intimidating. And finally, let me assure noble lords that the government remains committed to working with all groups to ensure that we produce updated guidance to ensure schemes on the ground are, yes, attractive, yes, accessible, but also fully consider all safety considerations.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
House to adjourn.